December 1944. Private Tanaka was dying. The Japanese prisoner had been given up for dead by his own doctors. The American physician who took his case performed something that would echo through the entire camp. Not a miracle of medicine. Something harder. A choice that defied every reason to walk away. The surgery hadn't happened yet, but 3 weeks earlier, when Tanaka first arrived at the POW camp in the Philippines, dying was already his most likely future. The camp sat on the edge of a former plantation, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. 200 Japanese prisoners lived there in December 1944. Men who'd been pulled from the wreckage of their collapsing Pacific defense. They slept in converted barracks that had once housed Filipino workers. They ate rice and whatever vegetables the American mess could spare. They worked repair details, fixing roads and buildings destroyed in the fighting. And they waited, uncertain whether they'd survive to see Japan again. For most of them, surrender had felt worse than death. They'd been taught since childhood that capture meant dishonor beyond redemption. Their military code was explicit. Fight until you die. And if you can't die fighting, die by your own hand. The Americans were devils who would torture prisoners, violate every law of war, commit atrocities that made death preferable. But here they were, alive, captured, and the Americans had done none of those things. It created a strange cognitive prison worse than the physical one. They'd violated everything they believed about themselves. Some of the men still couldn't meet each other's eyes. They moved through the camp like ghosts, performing their assigned work in silence, eating in silence, existing in a state of moral limbo that had no name. The Americans didn't make it easier. Most of the guards were combat veterans rotated back from the front lines. They'd seen friends die on beaches and in jungles. They'd heard stories about the Bataan Death March, where Japanese forces had marched 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners through the jungle, and thousands died from beatings, starvation, and summary executions. They'd heard about prisoners used for bayonet practice, about surrendering soldiers shot where they stood. So the guards watched the Japanese POWs with cold, careful distance. They followed the Geneva Conventions because they were ordered to. But there was no warmth in it, no mercy beyond the minimum required. The camp had a medical facility. Calling it a hospital would have been generous. It was a converted storage building with 8 beds, a surgery table that had been scrubbed clean but still bore rust stains, and whatever supplies the Navy could send up from Manila. The chief medical officer was Dr. James Weston, 32 years old, a surgeon who'd enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor. Weston was from Iowa, small town, farming community, the kind of place where everyone knew your family going back 3 generations. He'd gone to medical school in Chicago on a scholarship, planning to come back and be the town doctor. Then December 7th, 1941 happened. His younger brother Thomas was serving on the USS Arizona. Thomas was 19. He never made it off the ship. Weston had joined the Navy with one thought: save American lives, get them home. Make sure other families didn't lose their brothers, their sons, their fathers. For 3 years, he'd worked field hospitals and hospital ships, performing surgeries under bombardment, triaging wounded men who screamed for their mothers, making impossible choices about who got morphine and who had to endure without it because supplies were running low. He was good at his job. Clinical, efficient. He could shut off the part of himself that felt too much and just work. Hands steady. Mind clear. Do the next thing. Save the next life. But the POW camp assignment had tested that clinical distance in ways combat never did. The Japanese prisoners got sick like anyone else. Infections, tropical diseases, injuries from their work details. And they came to the medical facility because they had nowhere else to go. Weston treated them. He followed his oath. But he did the minimum. Antibiotics for infections, yes. Stitches for wounds, yes. But no extra care, no compassion. He'd look at a Japanese prisoner the way a mechanic looks at an engine. Fix what's broken. Move to the next one. His staff followed his lead. Corpsman Davis, who'd lost 3 friends at Guadalcanal, barely spoke to the Japanese patients. Nurse Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American woman from San Francisco, treated them with professional efficiency, but nothing more. Her family had fled Nanjing in 1937 after the Japanese invasion. She'd heard the stories from her grandmother about what Japanese soldiers did in that city. She knew her duty as a nurse. But she also knew what that flag had meant to her family. The Japanese POWs noticed. They weren't stupid. They could see the difference in how American soldiers were treated versus how they were treated. American wounded got the good beds near the windows. They got extra blankets. They got the surgeon's full attention. Japanese prisoners got the back corner. The oldest equipment, the minimum time necessary. None of them complained. Most expected worse. Then Kenji Tanaka arrived. He was 23 years old, though he looked older, malnourished like most of them. He'd been a farmer in Hokkaido before conscription, worked his family's rice fields, knew more about soil composition and crop rotation than military tactics. The army had given him 6 weeks of training and a rifle and shipped him to the Philippines. He'd spent 8 months in the jungle, watching his unit dissolve through combat and disease before American forces overran their position in November. He'd tried to follow the code. When his sergeant ordered them to fix bayonets for a final charge, Tanaka had gripped his rifle and prepared to die. But the sergeant had been killed by artillery before giving the final order. And when the Americans came through the smoke, shouting for them to surrender, Tanaka's hands had raised on their own. Some instinct deeper than training, older than duty, the simple animal desire to live another day. He hated himself for it. But he was alive. Tanaka had taken shrapnel during the artillery barrage. Pieces of metal had torn through his left side, puncturing his abdomen. A medic had bandaged him in the field, and he'd been sent to a field hospital, then transferred to the POW camp once he was stable enough to move. But stable was generous. The shrapnel wounds had closed on the surface, but inside damage was still happening. Internal bleeding, scar tissue forming wrong, infections brewing deep in his gut. He never mentioned it. Pain was expected. He worked his assigned details without complaint, stood for roll call, ate his rations. The other prisoners didn't know. The guards didn't notice. Even Tanaka didn't fully understand how bad it was. He just knew he felt weaker every day. Colder, like something vital was slowly draining away. The Japanese camp had its own doctor. Lieutenant Yamada, 45, a civilian surgeon who'd been conscripted late in the war. He'd served on the front lines, treating wounded soldiers with almost no supplies, watching men die from infections that any decent hospital could have cured. He'd surrendered along with his patients when their field hospital was captured. Now he lived in the POW camp, trying to care for 200 men with even less than he'd had in the jungle. Yamada had examined Tanaka twice. Both times he'd shaken his head and said nothing. What was there to say? The young man needed surgery. Real surgery in a real hospital, with proper equipment and blood for transfusions and antibiotics to fight infection. None of that existed here. Not for them. So Yamada had made his own impossible calculation. Save his energy for men he could actually help. Let fate decide the rest. Tanaka understood. He didn't blame the doctor. He just kept working, kept enduring, kept waiting for whatever came next. What came next happened on a Wednesday, December 13th, 1944. Morning work detail. Tanaka was assigned to a crew repairing a damaged warehouse roof. He climbed the ladder carefully, each rung sending sharp pains through his side. At the top, he gripped a hammer and began pulling bent nails from warped boards. The sun was already hot. Sweat ran down his face. His vision blurred at the edges. He didn't remember falling. One moment he was on the roof. The next he was on the ground, staring up at the sky, unable to breathe. The impact had driven the air from his lungs, but worse than that was the pain. Not the sharp pain of broken bones, something deeper, something tearing inside. Blood began soaking through his shirt, not from an external wound, from inside. The fall had ruptured something that had been barely holding together. Guards shouted. Other prisoners backed away, uncertain what to do. Someone ran for the medical facility. Tanaka lay on the packed dirt, feeling warmth spread beneath him, understanding with perfect clarity that he was bleeding to death. They carried him to the medical facility on a stretcher. Weston was in the middle of treating an American private who'd gashed his hand on barbed wire. He looked up when they brought Tanaka in, saw the blood-soaked shirt, the prisoner's gray pallor, the shallow breathing. "Put him in back," Weston said, and returned to stitching the private's hand. They laid Tanaka on one of the back beds. Corpsman Davis cut away his shirt and examined the wound site. No external bleeding. That meant internal. Davis had seen enough combat casualties to know what that meant. He checked Tanaka's pulse, his blood pressure, his breathing, all declining. "Doc," Davis called out, "this one's bad." Weston finished the stitches, bandaged the private's hand, sent him back to his unit. Then he walked to the back corner where Tanaka lay dying. He looked down at the Japanese prisoner. Young, maybe early 20s, eyes half closed, consciousness fading, body going into shock. Classic signs of internal hemorrhaging. Without surgery, the man had maybe 2 hours. Probably less. Weston had seen this 100 times. He knew the protocol for enemy POWs. Stabilize if possible. Make them comfortable. If the injury was beyond field treatment capacity, let nature take its course. Resources were limited. American wounded took priority. Nobody would question his decision to simply let this man die. He turned to walk away. That's when Lieutenant Yamada entered the medical facility. The Japanese doctor moved quietly, head down, showing no threat. He'd learned how to navigate the American spaces without causing alarm. He approached Weston and bowed slightly. "My patient," Yamada said in broken English, gesturing toward Tanaka. Weston nodded. "He's dying, internal bleeding. There's nothing I can do." Yamada looked at Tanaka for a long moment. Something passed across his face. Grief, maybe. Or just exhaustion. He bowed again to Weston and turned to leave. "Wait," Weston said. He didn't know why he said it. "How long has he been injured?" Yamada paused. 3 months. Shrapnel. I told him he needs surgery." He gestured vaguely at the camp. "But no surgery here. For us. Why didn't you ask for help?" The question hung in the air. Yamada looked at Weston with something approaching pity. "Would you have helped?" he asked quietly. Weston had no answer. They both knew the truth. Yamada left. Weston stood beside Tanaka's bed, watching the prisoner's breathing become more labored. Davis was checking on other patients. Nurse Chen was organizing supplies on the far side of the facility. Nobody was paying attention to the dying Japanese soldier in the back corner. This was supposed to be easy. Just walk away, return to his office, file the paperwork later. One less enemy soldier in the world. One step closer to ending this war. Thomas would never come home. Why should this man? But Weston's hands weren't moving. His feet weren't carrying him away. He just stood there, staring down at Tanaka, and something in his mind was breaking apart. He thought about Thomas. 19 years old, excited to serve his country. Sent letters home about seeing Pearl Harbor, about the beautiful Hawaiian sunrise he'd watched from the deck of the Arizona the morning before he died. Thomas had wanted to be a teacher. He'd talked about coming home after the war, getting his degree, teaching history to high school kids. Thomas was gone. Nothing would bring him back. But this man, this enemy soldier who'd tried to kill Americans, who represented everything Weston had spent 3 years fighting against. This man, was 23 years old. He'd been conscripted. Probably didn't want to be in this war any more than Thomas did. He'd fallen off a roof. And now he was bleeding to death in a corner while everyone looked away. Weston reached for his stethoscope. He pressed it against Tanaka's chest, listening to the heartbeat. Fast, weak, struggling. He palpated the abdomen, rigid, distended, fluid accumulation. Definitely internal bleeding, probably from the original shrapnel wounds that had never properly healed. To save him would require surgery. Real surgery. Opening him up. Finding the bleeds, repairing damaged tissue, hoping he survived the trauma and the shock and the infection risk. It would take hours. It would use precious supplies. It would require his full attention and skill. And it would mean choosing to save an enemy soldier's life, when American wounded might arrive any minute who would need those same resources. Every calculation said, walk away. But Weston couldn't. Because somewhere in the past 3 years of war, in the blood and screaming and endless tide of broken bodies, he'd started to forget why he became a doctor. It wasn't to serve a nation. It wasn't to win a war. It was to save lives. Every life. The oath didn't have exceptions for nationality or uniform. He'd violated that oath every day in this camp, giving minimal care to the Japanese prisoners, letting the ones who were too far gone simply die. He'd told himself it was necessary. Resources were limited. Americans came first. That was the reality of war. But standing over Tanaka, watching him die, Weston understood that he'd been making excuses. He'd let his grief over Thomas become permission to be less than what he'd sworn to be. And if he walked away now? If he let this man die when he had the skill to save him, then Thomas's death would have broken something in him that could never be repaired. Some choices you don't make with your head. "Davis," Weston called, "prep for surgery." Davis looked up, confused. Which patient? Weston gestured to Tanaka. "This one." The facility went silent. Chen stopped organizing supplies. Davis stared at Weston like he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Doc," Davis said carefully, "that's a Jap POW. I'm aware. He's dying anyway. Why waste the supplies?" "Because I'm a doctor," Weston said. His voice was steady. "Certain. Prep for surgery. Now." Davis didn't move. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard. "My friend's died because of men like him. You want me to help save his life?" "No," Weston said. "I don't. You're dismissed." Davis stood there for another moment, then threw down the bandages he'd been holding and walked out. The door slammed behind him. Weston looked at Chen. "Nurse Chen, I need your help." Chen's face was unreadable. She was Chinese-American, born in San Francisco but raised on stories of what Japan did to China. Her grandmother had watched Japanese soldiers burn villages. Her uncles had died fighting the invasion. She had every reason to refuse. She walked over to the surgery table and began laying out instruments. "Let's move him," she said quietly. They transferred Tanaka from the bed to the surgery table. He was barely conscious, mumbling in Japanese, unaware of what was happening. Weston started an IV, pushing fluids to combat the shock. Chen prepared the anesthesia. They had ether, enough for maybe an hour of surgery. After that, Tanaka would be on his own. Outside, word was spreading. American soldiers were gathering near the medical facility, talking in low voices. Some were angry. Some were confused. All of them wanted to know why their doctor was about to spend hours trying to save an enemy soldier's life. On the other side of the camp, Japanese prisoners were gathering at the fence that separated their barracks from the medical facility. They'd heard about Tanaka's fall. They'd heard that the American doctor was operating. None of them understood. It had to be a trick, some elaborate cruelty. Americans didn't save Japanese lives, but they watched anyway. Silent, waiting. Inside, Weston scrubbed his hands. He'd performed this surgery a dozen times on American wounded. Exploratory laparotomy. Open the abdomen, find the source of bleeding, repair it, close him up. In a proper hospital with proper equipment, it had maybe a 70% survival rate. Here, with limited supplies, on a malnourished patient who'd been dying for weeks, with questionable sanitation and no way to do blood transfusions? 20%, if he was lucky. Chen tied Weston's surgical gown. Their eyes met. "Why are you helping?" Weston asked her. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father used to say, 'Hate the war, not the soldier.' I always thought it was naive." She looked down at Tanaka's unconscious face. "Maybe it's not." Weston nodded. He picked up the scalpel. His hands were shaking. Years of steady surgical control, and now his hands betrayed him. Because this wasn't just a surgery. This was a statement, a line in the sand, a choice that would define who he was beyond this war. "Ready?" he asked Chen. "Ready." Weston placed the scalpel against Tanaka's abdomen. Through the window, the sun was climbing higher, burning away the morning clouds. Outside, two crowds watched and waited. Americans who wanted to know why their doctor would betray them, and Japanese prisoners who didn't dare hope for mercy. The blade touched skin, and everything that happened next would echo through the camp in ways none of them could have imagined. The first incision released a rush of blood and fluid. Dark. Too much of it. Weston's jaw tightened as he extended the cut, opening Tanaka's abdomen from sternum to navel. Chen immediately began suctioning, clearing the field so he could see what he was working with. What he saw wasn't encouraging. The abdominal cavity was a mess. 3 months of untreated shrapnel damage had created a landscape of scar tissue, adhesions, and chronic inflammation. Weston could see at least 2 active bleeding sites, maybe more hidden beneath the damaged tissue. The intestines were inflamed and partially obstructed. One section of bowel looked necrotic. "Jesus," he muttered. Chen said nothing, just kept suctioning, keeping the surgical field as clear as possible. Her hands were steady, professional. But Weston could see the tension in her shoulders. He started with the most obvious bleeder, a partially severed mesenteric artery that was pumping blood into the abdominal cavity. He clamped it, tied it off, moved to the next. Beneath that was a tear in the liver, slowly oozing. He packed it with gauze, applied pressure. Outside the window, faces pressed against the glass. American soldiers watching their doctor work on the enemy. Weston could feel their eyes like a physical weight. He forced himself to ignore them, focus on the work, hands steady, mind clear. But his hands weren't steady. They trembled as he navigated through the damaged tissue, and he knew why. This wasn't just surgery. Every suture he placed was a choice. Every minute he spent trying to save this man's life was time he couldn't get back. If an American soldier came in needing emergency care, he'd be here, elbow deep in a Japanese prisoner, unable to help his own countrymen. The weight of that possibility made his fingers shake. Chen noticed. She glanced up at him, then back down at the surgical field. "Doctor," she said quietly, "the mesenteric bleeder. You need to check your tie. It's not secure." Weston looked. She was right. The suture was loose, already starting to seep. His shaking hands had botched it. He cursed under his breath and redid the tie, this time getting it right. "Thank you," he said. "Focus," Chen replied. Not unkindly, just stating fact. "He needs you present." She was right. Weston took a breath, forced his mind to narrow. The war didn't exist. Thomas didn't exist. The watching soldiers didn't exist. There was only this body, this damage, this moment. He moved to the necrotic section of bowel. It would have to be resected. Cut out the dead tissue, reconnect the healthy sections. It was a delicate procedure even in ideal conditions. Here, with Tanaka already in shock, already depleted. It might kill him. But leaving it would definitely kill him. Weston made the call. "I'm resecting the bowel. I'll need silk sutures for the anastomosis." Chen had them ready before he finished speaking. She'd anticipated the need. Good nurse. Great nurse, actually. Weston felt a flash of gratitude for her presence. He couldn't have done this alone. The resection took 40 minutes. Careful cutting, precise reconnection, testing the anastomosis for leaks. Tanaka's blood pressure was dropping. His heart rate was climbing. The anesthesia was wearing thin, and they were running out of ether. "How much time do we have?" Weston asked. Chen checked the ether supply. "Maybe 15 minutes before we're empty?" 15 minutes? Weston still had to check for more bleeding. Irrigate the abdomen. Close multiple layers of tissue. 15 minutes wasn't enough. "Give me what you can," he said. "When it runs out, it runs out." He worked faster. Found another small bleeder in the abdominal wall. Cauterized it. Checked the liver packing. Still oozing, but controlled. Irrigated with saline, washing out blood and contaminants. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but inside his mind was calculating odds. Blood loss, shock, infection risk, surgical trauma, every factor working against them. 20% survival rate, maybe less now. The door to the medical facility opened. Weston glanced up, expecting another American soldier coming to watch or protest. Instead, Lieutenant Yamada stood in the doorway. The Japanese doctor approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance from the surgery table. He looked at Tanaka's open abdomen, at the resected bowel, at the controlled bleeding sites. His face showed recognition, professional assessment. He knew exactly what Weston was doing and how difficult it was. "You're trying to save him," Yamada said. But not a question. An observation tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Weston said, not looking up from his work. Yamada watched for a moment longer. Then he bowed deeper than before and backed away. He didn't leave the facility. He just stood against the far wall, silent, bearing witness. Weston returned to the surgery. The ether was almost gone. Tanaka was starting to move slightly, reflexive twitches as consciousness began seeping back. Not good. Weston needed him absolutely still for the closure. "Chen, is there any way to stretch the ether?" "Already maximized the mixture," she said. "This is it. Then I work fast." He began closing. First the peritoneum, the inner lining of the abdominal wall. Then the muscle layers. Then the fascia. Each layer required precise suturing to prevent herniation, to give the wound strength to heal. Each layer took time they didn't have. The ether ran out with 2 layers still to go. Tanaka's eyes fluttered. His breathing changed, becoming faster, more distressed. He was waking up, mid-surgery, with his abdomen still open. "Hold him," Weston said. Chen moved to Tanaka's shoulders, applying gentle but firm pressure. "I've got him." Yamada stepped forward without being asked. He took Tanaka's legs, holding them steady. The Japanese doctor's eyes met Weston's across the surgery table. A moment of understanding passed between them. 2 physicians trying to save a life. Nothing else mattered in that moment. Weston worked with controlled urgency. The fascia layer, critical for preventing the wound from rupturing. His needle moved in and out, placing sutures with the muscle memory of thousands of previous surgeries. Tanaka was moaning now, a low sound of confusion and pain. His body tried to move, but Chen and Yamada held him steady. "Almost done," Weston said. To Tanaka, though the prisoner couldn't understand English. "Just hold on." The final layer. Skin closure. Weston switched to a larger needle, worked as fast as precision allowed. Tanaka's moaning grew louder. His eyes opened, unfocused and terrified, seeing the lights above him, feeling the pain in his abdomen, but not understanding why. Chen leaned close to Tanaka's face. She spoke softly in Japanese. Weston didn't know what she said, but her voice was calm, reassuring. Tanaka's eyes found her face and held there, desperate for anything to anchor to. Last suture. Weston tied it off. Done. They moved Tanaka to a recovery bed immediately. Chen started another IV, pushing more fluids. Yamada checked the prisoner's pulse, his pupils, his breathing. Weston applied a heavy bandage to the surgical site, wrapping it tight to control any surface bleeding. Tanaka's eyes were closed again, unconscious or just overwhelmed. His vitals were terrible. Blood pressure barely measurable, heart rate erratic, breathing shallow and rapid. He's in severe shock, Yamada said quietly. Weston knew. The surgery had been necessary, but the trauma of it might kill Tanaka anyway. The next 12 hours would tell the story. Either his body would rally, would find some reserve of strength and fight back toward life, or he would slip away despite everything they'd done. 20%, maybe less. Weston stripped off his surgical gloves. His hands were shaking again, but now from exhaustion rather than doubt. 3 hours. The surgery had taken 3 hours. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was past noon. Outside, the crowds had grown. More American soldiers had gathered, drawn by word of what was happening. The Japanese prisoners were still at the fence, pressed against the wire, staring toward the medical facility windows, waiting for news. Chen was cleaning up the surgical instruments. Yamada remained by Tanaka's bedside, monitoring his patient with the focused attention of a doctor who'd seen too many men die. The door opened. Corpsman Davis stood in the entrance, his expression hard to read. He looked at Tanaka in the recovery bed, at the bandaged abdomen, at the IV lines running fluids into the unconscious prisoner. "Is he going to make it?" Davis asked. "I don't know," Weston said honestly. "Maybe." Davis nodded slowly. He walked to the supply cabinet, took out fresh bandages and antiseptic. Then, he approached Tanaka's bed and began checking the IV lines, adjusting the drip rate, doing the job of a corpsman, because that's what he was trained to do. "I'm still angry," Davis said, without looking at Weston. "I still think this is wrong. But if you're going to save his life, we better do it right." Chen caught Weston's eye. Something passed between them. Not quite a smile, just acknowledgement that the weight they were carrying had gotten slightly lighter. The rest of the day passed in tense vigilance. Weston remained in the medical facility, checking on Tanaka every 30 minutes. Blood pressure stabilizing slightly, heart rate still elevated but not worsening. Breathing shallow but consistent. Small victories. Not enough to declare success, just enough to keep hoping. As evening fell, the camp's commanding officer arrived. Captain Morrison was a career Navy man, 48 years old, weathered by years of service. He had been informed of the surgery hours ago, but had waited to see if the prisoner would survive before making his assessment. He found Weston in his office, filling out paperwork for the procedure. "Dr. Weston," Morrison said. Not unfriendly, just formal. "I need to understand what happened today." Weston set down his pen. "I performed emergency surgery on a POW who would have died otherwise." "Why?" It was the question everyone wanted answered. Why save an enemy soldier when you had every excuse not to? Weston was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I took an oath, sir, to do no harm, to save lives when I have the ability. That oath doesn't have a nationality clause." Morrison considered this. "Some of the men are upset. They think you're betraying American soldiers by using resources on the enemy." "Some of the men lost friends in this war," Weston said. "I understand their anger, but I'm a doctor, not a soldier. My job is to heal, not to choose whose life is worth saving based on which flag they served. And if an American soldier had come in during that surgery, needed emergency care, what then? It was the question Weston had been asking himself. Then I would have faced an impossible choice. But that didn't happen. I had the time, the supplies, and the ability. So I used them. Morrison nodded. He walked to the window, looked out at the camp. The Japanese prisoners were still at the fence, watching the medical facility. You know what's strange? Morrison said. I've been running this camp for 4 months. Those men out there, they work their details. They follow orders. But there's no connection. They hate us, we hate them, and everyone just goes through the motions. But today something changed. You saw them at the fence? Yes, sir. They've been there for hours, not talking, not moving, just watching. Like they're waiting to see if we're capable of being something other than enemies. Morrison turned back to Weston. Maybe that's worth 3 hours of surgery time. He left without another word. Weston sat in his office, feeling the weight of the day settling into his bones. Around 8 p.m., Tanaka's condition began to shift. His blood pressure rose slightly. His heart rate steadied. He remained unconscious. But his breathing deepened, moved from the shallow panting of shock towards something closer to sleep. Yamada was still there, had never left his patient's side. He looked at the vital signs and permitted himself the smallest nod of cautious optimism. He's fighting, the Japanese doctor said. Chen heard it. Davis heard it. Even the American soldiers who'd been watching through the windows heard it. The prisoner was fighting to live. And for reasons none of them could fully articulate, they found themselves hoping he would win. The night passed slowly. Weston dozed in his office chair, waking every hour to check on Tanaka. Each time, the vital signs were slightly better. Not good, just better. The trajectory pointing toward life instead of death. By morning, Tanaka's eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling, confused, disoriented. Then he felt the pain in his abdomen and tried to sit up. Chen was there immediately, pressing him gently back down. Rest, she said in Japanese. You had surgery. You need to rest. Tanaka looked at her. A Chinese woman in an American uniform speaking his language. Nothing made sense. He tried to ask questions, but his throat was too dry. Chen brought him water, helped him drink slowly. Weston appeared at the bedside. He checked the surgical site, the bandages. No signs of infection yet. The wound was clean, properly closed. The IVV was running clear. Everything as good as could be hoped for at 18 hours post-surgery. Am I dying? Tanaka asked Chen in Japanese. She translated the question for Weston. Tell him no, Weston said. Tell him he's going to live. Chen relayed the message. Tanaka's face showed confusion more than relief. He looked at Weston, at the American doctor who'd saved his life. And something broke in his expression. Not joy. Something deeper. A question that couldn't be formed into words. Why? Weston saw the question in Tanaka's eyes. He didn't have a good answer. He'd spent all night trying to articulate it to himself, to Morrison, to his own conscience. The oath, the humanity. The choice to be something other than the war tried to make him. But standing there, looking at this young Japanese soldier who'd survived against all odds, Weston realized the answer was simpler than he'd thought. Because you needed help, he said quietly. He knew Tanaka couldn't understand English, but he said it anyway. And I could give it. Chen didn't translate. She didn't need to. The meaning passed between them without language. Tanaka closed his eyes. His body relaxed into the bed. And for the first time since his surrender 3 weeks earlier, something like peace crossed his face. Outside, the sun was rising over the camp. The Japanese prisoners at the fence had finally dispersed, returning to their barracks. But they moved differently now, less like ghosts, more like men who'd witnessed something that changed their understanding of the world. The American soldiers were talking among themselves. Some still angry, some confused, but some were beginning to ask different questions. Not why did Weston save the enemy, but what does it mean that he did? Davis approached Weston as he left Tanaka's bedside. "Doc," Davis said, "I need to say something." Weston waited. "I was wrong," Davis said. The words came hard, about not helping. "I let my anger make me less than what I'm supposed to be. That man in there, he didn't kill my friends. He's just another guy who got pulled into this war and tried to survive it. And you reminded me that we're supposed to be the good guys, the ones who don't lose their humanity just because it's easier." "You came back," Weston said. "That's what matters." Davis nodded. Then he went to check on the other patients, returning to the work of caring because that's what corpsmen do. Chen was cleaning up the recovery area. She moved with the same professional efficiency she always had. But Weston noticed her glancing at Tanaka's bed more often, checking his breathing, his color, his comfort. "Your father was right," Weston said to her. She looked up. "About what?" "I hate the war, not the soldier." Chen smiled slightly. "He also said that loving your enemy is easy in theory, but in practice it costs you everything you thought you knew about yourself." "Is that how you feel?" "I feel like I just spent 3 hours helping save a man whose army destroyed my grandmother's village. And I don't regret it, so yes. It cost me something. My certainty, maybe. My ability to hate cleanly." She looked at Tanaka's sleeping form. "But I think I'm better for the loss." As they wheeled Tanaka to recovery, something had shifted in the camp. The Japanese POWs at the fence hadn't moved. They just watched, silent as stones, as their enemy carried one of their own toward life instead of death. And in that witnessing, a question began to form that would ripple through both populations. If an American doctor could choose mercy over vengeance, what did that mean about everything they'd been taught to believe? The answer wouldn't come easy. But for the first time since the camp opened, both sides were willing to ask. 48 hours after surgery, Tanaka woke fully for the first time. The pain was still there, sharp and deep, but different than before. This was the pain of healing, rather than dying. His mind was clear enough to understand where he was, the American medical facility, alive, inexplicably alive. Chen was checking his vitals when his eyes opened. She smiled at him, a small, professional smile that still carried warmth. "Good morning," she said in Japanese. "You're recovering well." Tanaka tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She brought water, helped him drink. After a moment, he found his voice. "Why am I alive?" It was the question that had been consuming him in his brief moments of consciousness. By every rule he understood about the world, about war, about honor and duty, and the way enemies treated each other, he should be dead. He'd expected death, almost welcomed it as an end to the shame of capture. Instead, an American doctor had spent hours saving his life. Chen sat on the edge of his bed. Through gestures and her limited Japanese, supplemented with drawings on a notepad, she explained what had happened. The fall. The internal bleeding, doctor. Weston's decision to operate. The 3-hour surgery. The night of uncertainty. Tanaka listened, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been grief. "But why?" he asked again. "I am the enemy." Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The doctor believes that every life has value, even in war, maybe especially in war." Tanaka turned his face away. His shoulders began to shake. He was crying, the first Japanese prisoner to cry openly in the camp, letting the tears flow without attempting to hide them or apologize for them. Chen let him cry. She didn't try to comfort him or stop him. She understood that these tears were necessary, that something in Tanaka was breaking open that needed to break. After a long while, Tanaka spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. In Japan, we are taught that Americans are devils, that you have no honor, no mercy. That surrender means torture and death. He looked back at Chen, but a devil did not save my life. No, Chen said, a man did. The word hung in the air between them. Man, not American, not enemy, not devil, just man. The simplest, most profound designation. Word of Tanaka's survival spread through the camp that day. Among the American soldiers, reactions were mixed. Some remained angry, viewing Weston's choice as a betrayal. Others were simply confused, uncertain what it meant that their doctor had worked so hard to save an enemy life. But a few, a small but growing few, began to see Tanaka differently, not as a faceless enemy, but as a specific young man who'd survived impossible odds. Among the Japanese prisoners, the impact was deeper and more immediate. They'd watched one of their own nearly die, then watched an American doctor fight to save him. It contradicted everything they'd been taught about their captors. It created a cognitive dissonance that forced them to reconsider assumptions they'd held as absolute truth. Lieutenant Yamada felt it most acutely. He'd been a doctor for 20 years before the war, had taken the same oath as Weston, had sworn to save lives, regardless of who those lives belonged to. But somewhere in the years of warfare, of scarcity and triage, and watching men die because there weren't enough supplies, he'd lost track of that oath. He'd let circumstances justify doing less than he was capable of. Then, he'd watched an American doctor, who had every excuse to walk away, choose differently. 3 days after Tanaka's surgery, Yamada did something unprecedented. He approached the medical facility during daylight hours and asked to speak with Dr. Weston. The American guards were suspicious, but Weston agreed to see him. They sat in his office, two physicians from opposite sides of a brutal war, attempting to communicate through broken English and hand gestures. I have patient, Yamada said, struggling with the words. Infection, I can treat, but... He gestured helplessly. No medicine. He will die. Weston understood. Another Japanese prisoner with a treatable condition that would become fatal without proper supplies. In the old calculus, before Tanaka, Weston would have said no or offered minimal help. Just enough to say he'd followed protocol, not enough to make a real difference. But something had changed. The surgery had broken something in him, or fixed something. He wasn't sure which. He just knew that he couldn't go back to the old way of seeing. Bring him here, Weston said. I'll treat him. Yamada's face showed shock, then something approaching gratitude. He bowed deeply. Thank you. I will help you. If you need, I can help with your patients. It was an offer loaded with meaning. A Japanese doctor offering to help treat American wounded. A bridge extended across the gulf of war. Weston considered it. Captain Morrison might object. The American soldiers might react badly. But there was also a shortage of medical personnel, and Yamada was clearly skilled. Yes, Weston said. I need help. That afternoon, Yamada brought his patient, a young prisoner with a severe leg infection that was bordering on septic. Weston examined him, confirmed the diagnosis, started him on antibiotics. Yamada watched the treatment, asked questions about dosage and application, took mental notes about supplies and techniques. Then, without being asked, Yamada moved to help Chen with other patients. He changed bandages on an American private's burned hand. He checked vitals on a sergeant recovering from dengue fever. He worked with the same quiet competence he'd shown with Tanaka, treating American soldiers with the same care he gave his own countrymen. The American patients noticed. Some were uncomfortable, visibly tense, having a Japanese doctor touch them. Others watched with curiosity, seeing the strangeness of being treated by an enemy who showed nothing but professional concern for their well-being. Davis observed it all. After an hour, he approached Yamada with supplies for the next patient. "Here," he said, handing over clean gauze. "You'll need these." Yamada took the supplies and bowed. Davis didn't bow back, but he nodded. A small acknowledgement. Not friendship, just recognition of shared purpose. The days began to blur together. Tanaka's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The infection Weston had feared never materialized. The surgical site healed cleanly. 2 weeks after the operation, Tanaka was able to sit up without assistance. 3 weeks. He could walk short distances. He spent much of his recovery time watching the medical facility operate. He saw Yamada working alongside the American staff. He saw Chen treating both American soldiers and Japanese prisoners with the same care. He saw Davis, who'd initially refused to help, now checking on Tanaka's wound without being asked. Most significantly, he watched Dr. Weston. The American doctor moved through the facility with quiet intensity, focused on his work, treating every patient, American or Japanese, as if their life mattered equally. Tanaka couldn't speak English, couldn't have a conversation with Weston, but he didn't need language to understand what he was witnessing. This was what a doctor was supposed to be. What a man was supposed to be. Someone who chose humanity over hatred, even when hatred would have been easier. One afternoon, in early January, Tanaka attempted to help in the medical facility. His English was non-existent, but work required little translation. He cleaned equipment. He carried supplies. He did whatever small tasks were needed. Weston found him sterilizing surgical instruments, moving carefully to not strain his healing abdomen. "You should be resting," Weston said, even though he knew Tanaka couldn't understand the words. Chen appeared to translate. Tanaka's response came through her. "He says rest is good for the body, but work is good for the soul. He wants to help. He says it's the only way he can repay what you did." "Tell him he doesn't owe me anything," Weston said. Chen translated. Tanaka listened, then spoke again. Chen smiled slightly at his words. "He says yes. He does owe you. He owes you his life, and that's a debt that can never be repaid. But he can try, and trying matters." Weston looked at Tanaka, this young Japanese soldier who'd nearly died, who'd survived because Weston made an impossible choice, who now wanted to give back in the only way he could. "Tell him," Weston paused, searching for the right words. "Tell him that if he wants to repay me, he should live well, survive this war, go home, be a good man. That's all the payment I need." Chen translated. Tanaka's eyes filled with tears again, but he bowed and returned to his work with renewed purpose. By February, the medical facility had become something unprecedented, a space where the war's divisions seemed to blur. American soldiers received care from a Japanese doctor. Japanese prisoners received care from American staff. And everyone involved began to see each other less as enemies and more as men trapped in the same terrible circumstances, trying to survive with whatever humanity they could preserve. It wasn't universal. Many American soldiers still hated the Japanese prisoners. Many Japanese prisoners still feared and mistrusted their captors. The war hadn't ended. The grudges hadn't disappeared. But a crack had formed in the absolute certainty of mutual hatred. And through that crack, something like understanding began to seep in. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed closer to Japan and the war's end became inevitable, Tanaka tried to write a letter home. He'd been given paper and pencil by Chen, who'd told him that letters would be held until after the war, but he could write them anyway. He wrote in careful characters about the American doctor, who had no reason to save him, but did anyway. About the Chinese nurse who showed him kindness. About the corpsman who'd overcome his anger to provide care. About the Japanese doctor who'd found his oath again by watching an enemy live up to his. The letter would never be sent. The war hadn't ended yet, and mail from POWs wasn't permitted. But Tanaka kept it anyway, folded carefully in his pocket, a testimony to something that mattered more than victory or defeat. May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe ended. News reached the camp through official channels, and the American soldiers celebrated. The Japanese prisoners heard the news with quiet dread. If Germany had fallen, Japan's defeat was only a matter of time. Tanaka heard it and felt a complex tangle of emotions. Relief that the dying might end. Shame that his country was losing. Fear about what would happen to him, to his family, to Japan itself. And underneath all of it, a strange gratitude that he was alive to feel any of it at all. 3 months later, August 1945, the war ended, not gradually, but in 2 blinding flashes of atomic fire. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, then surrender. The POW camp received word of the surrender on August 15th. The Japanese prisoners gathered in stunned silence as the announcement was read. Their emperor had spoken on the radio, telling them the war was over. To the American soldiers, it meant they could finally go home. To the Japanese prisoners, it meant they'd lost everything. The war, their honor, their purpose. But they were alive. And in the following weeks, as arrangements were made for repatriation, that fact began to matter more than the shame. Before he left, Tanaka had one final encounter with Weston. They met in the medical facility, the place where Tanaka's life had been saved 7 months earlier. No interpreter was available. Chen had already been transferred to another assignment. Just the 2 men who'd shared a connection deeper than language. Tanaka bowed, not the perfunctory bow of protocol, but a deep bow of profound respect and gratitude. When he straightened, his eyes met Weston's. Weston extended his hand. The American gesture of goodwill and closure. Tanaka looked at the offered hand. In Japanese culture, physical contact between men was uncommon, especially between strangers. But this wasn't a stranger. This was the man who'd given him his life back. He took Weston's hand and shook it firmly. Then, on impulse, he pulled Weston into a brief embrace. A violation of cultural norms on both sides. A gesture that transcended protocol to express something words couldn't capture in any language. When they separated, both men had tears in their eyes. "Thank you," Tanaka said in English, the only English words he'd learned. He'd practiced them for days, wanting to say them correctly. "You're welcome," Weston replied. Then, not knowing if Tanaka would understand, but needing to say it anyway, "Be well. Live well. Remember that your life matters." They stood there for a moment longer, 2 men on opposite sides of a war that had tried to make them hate each other, finding instead that they'd learned to see each other's humanity. Then Tanaka bowed once more and left. Weston watched him go, wondering if he'd ever know what happened to the young Japanese soldier whose life he'd saved on a December morning when everything seemed impossible. 17 years later, May 1962. Dr. Kenji Tanaka stood in his clinic in rural Hokkaido, treating a farmer's son who'd broken his arm falling from a tractor. The boy was scared, crying from pain and fear. Tanaka spoke softly to him as he set the bone, explaining what he was doing, why it hurt, but why it was necessary, why the boy would heal and be fine. The boy calmed under Tanaka's steady presence. His parents watched with gratitude as their town doctor fixed their son with the same gentle competence he brought to every patient. After the boy left, Tanaka returned to his office. He'd become a doctor after the war, driven by what he'd witnessed in that POW camp. If an enemy could show such compassion, such commitment to the value of every life, then Tanaka wanted to be that kind of person, that kind of doctor. He'd gone to medical school on a government program for veterans, studied hard, graduated with honors, returned to his home region to serve the farming communities he'd grown up in. For 17 years, he'd treated illness and injury with the same principle Weston had taught him through action rather than words. Every life matters. The mail arrived that afternoon. Among the usual letters was one from America. A letter forwarded through several channels before finding him. It was from a woman named Margaret Weston. Tanaka's hands shook as he opened it. He read slowly, his English still imperfect but functional enough to understand the essential message. Dr. James Weston had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Heart attack, quick and painless. He'd been 49 years old. Margaret Weston wrote that her husband had spoken of Private Tanaka many times over the years, how saving Tanaka's life had been the most important thing he'd done during the war, how it had reminded him why he became a doctor in the first place, how he'd often wondered what happened to the young Japanese soldier he'd pulled back from death. She'd found Tanaka's name in her husband's papers, a note written years ago, expressing hope that the young man had survived and found peace. Margaret had decided, after James's death, to try to find Tanaka and let him know that James had never forgotten him. And enclosed with the letter was something else. A small box containing James Weston's surgical instruments from the war. The scalpel, the clamps, the suture needles. The tools he'd used to save Tanaka's life in December 1944. A note inside the box, in Weston's handwriting, for Private Tanaka, if he can be found. These tools saved your life. I hope you've lived it well. You were the patient who taught me why I became a doctor. Thank you for that gift. Tanaka sat at his desk for a long time, the surgical instruments spread before him, tears running down his face. That evening, he placed the instruments in a glass case in his clinic's waiting room. He added a small plaque explaining their significance. These instruments were used by an American doctor to save an enemy soldier's life during war. They remind us that humanity is stronger than hatred and that every life deserves to be saved. Every young doctor who came through Tanaka's clinic heard the story about the American surgeon who chose mercy over vengeance, about the surgery that should have been impossible, about the way one choice rippled outward, changing not just Tanaka's life, but the lives of everyone who'd witnessed it. Those young doctors carried this story with them. Some of them became teachers, passing it to their students. Some became writers, telling it to wider audiences. Some just held it quietly in their hearts as a reminder of what medicine, what humanity could be at its best. And in small ways, invisible ways, the choice James Weston made in December 1944 continued to echo across decades, across oceans, across the space between enemy and friend. Because some victories aren't won with weapons. Some are won with steady hands and the stubborn belief that every life matters, even when everything says it shouldn't. In a war that tried to teach men to be monsters, a few chose to remain human. And that choice, made in a surgical tent while crowds watched through fences, proved stronger than all the violence and hatred that surrounded it. It proved that even in humanity's darkest moments, we can still choose light. We can still choose to see each other. We can still choose to save rather than destroy. That choice cost Weston nothing but 3 hours and some medical supplies. But it gave Tanaka 40 more years of life. And through those years, through the patients he treated and the doctors he inspired and the story that spread in quiet ways, that single choice continued to matter. Some debts can never be repaid, but they can be honored. They can be remembered. They can be passed forward to the next person who faces an impossible choice and wonders if choosing mercy is worth the cost. Tanaka knew the answer. Every patient he saved, every life he touched, every moment he honored the gift Weston had given him, these were his repayment. Not to Weston, who was gone, but to the principle Weston had embodied, that humanity isn't something we lose in war. It's something we choose, moment by moment, even when choosing it costs us everything, even when hatred would be easier, even when walking away would be justified. We choose. And that choice, more than any weapon or strategy or victory, is what defines us. In his clinic in Hokkaido, with Weston's surgical tools gleaming in their case, Tanaka carried that truth forward, a living testimony to what one American doctor had proven on a December morning in 1944. That mercy is stronger than vengeance. That healing is more powerful than harm. That a life saved matters more than a war won. And that sometimes the most profound victories are the ones measured not in territory taken or enemies defeated, but in hearts changed and humanity preserved. One patient, one surgery, one impossible choice. The ripples never stop.